Do you like allomancy? Do you like politics? Well, if you do, you're going to love The Well of Ascension. Welcome back, everybody. Last time we reviewed The Final Empire, which is book 1 of Mistborn, that one right there, and now I'm taking you through The Well of Ascension, book 2. So this one obviously will contain some spoilers for book 1. That's just kind of natural because this is the second book of the trilogy, so I will try to not spoil too much, but I'm going to spoil some things. So this takes place a year after book 1. Vin killed the Lord Ruler. Elend was actually put in charge of Luthadel, so he's essentially the king now, and him and the rest of the crew are basically just trying to figure their way out of creating and implementing a new government, making sure that Luthadel is rebuilt, things like that. So Elend installs essentially a democracy. They create a council of, I believe it was either a dozen or like 20 other people to essentially vote on things and decide what's best for Luthadel moving forward. So a year into this program and the style of government, things are going relatively well, but obviously it's shaky. They are running out of food, money, things like that, so ignore what I just said because they're not going that well. And of course, hi Loki. While this is going on, Elend Venture shows up with an army of about 50,000 people to try to intimidate Elend and the crew and overtake Luthadel, because he still believes that the Lord Ruler's ADM cache is inside there somewhere. So he's basically threatening him to take over the city, and a bunch of the council members seem to want to turn it over to them because they're like, look, Elend, we don't have the military strength, we can't defend this guy, like we should just turn it over to him, go back to normal, we'll keep our noble houses, Skas can be slave, etc., etc. And obviously Elend and the crew don't want that to happen, because why did they just spend all that time and sacrifice to overthrow the Lord Ruler just to put it back to the way things were? Also, of course, during the siege, Set shows up, and he's from another dominance near Luthadel, and he also has 50,000 troops roughly. And Ham was with him, basically undercover, and comes riding into the city, and he says, okay, I brought him here hoping that they would kind of stand off, because if one attacks, the other one could come up from behind and attack them. So there's kind of like a three-way standoff. Meanwhile, Sazed, who gets a lot more time in this book, is actually off kind of out in the wilderness, just, you know, living a simple life, teaching religions, things like that. Marsh actually finds him and says, look, like, you need to come back to Luthadel. So they start their travel back there. And on his way, he runs into Jaskies. I'm probably butchering his name because I don't remember the way the audiobook said it. It's Elend's old friend from the first book, one of his like group that they used to get together and talk about politics and stuff. He's actually leading an army of Kolos, which seems kind of crazy. You're like, how are you controlling these guys? And he also wants the throne. So essentially he lets Sazed through, and Sazed warns them that Jaskies and this army of 20,000 Kolos, I believe, are also coming to the city. So then you have 3 armies besieging Luthadel. So great. Things can't just be easy, can they? As if the armies weren't bad enough, there's also a lot more going on with the weather in this book. As soon as the Lord Ruler was defeated, he basically told the crew, like, look, you have no idea what you're doing. I've protected you guys, even if you didn't see it. Like, you've doomed yourselves. Everyone was just kind of like, what? That's okay, what are you talking about? So they thought, okay, Lord Ruler's dead. It's been a year. Things are getting worse. What's happening? The ash is continuing almost at a relentless pace now. It's coming down thicker and heavier. The mists are even heavier at night, and the mists also roll in during the day. Sorry, my dog is trying to get me to play fetch right now. Go away. The weather mixed with all the people attacking Luthadel trying to take it over is just basically a recipe for disaster. What, man? So when I started this book, it was pretty interesting because after reading book 1 and thinking, okay, the Lord Ruler is going to be, you know, the big bad of this trilogy. He's kind of going to be there in the background. They'll probably face off with him in the 3rd book, and then he dies in book 1. I was like, okay, so where's it going to go from here? And when he says that thing at the end of like, you guys have doomed yourselves, it's like, uh-oh. That's not good. So that's basically a brief summary of what happens. Essentially, this book focuses a lot more on the politics of Luthadel and of our main characters. It's a lot less allomancy and combat, and a lot more dialogue, very heavy on the politicking around Luthadel. nobleman trying to get a grasp on, like, okay, how should we move forward with this new society? What should our democracy look like? Elend's trying to be a good king. Now, that's not to say that this book does not have combat, because it does have a lot. It's just more towards the end, and the final act of the story, the last 150 pages or so, really ramps up, and it gets pretty intense. Due to the heavy-handedness of the politics and the dialogue in this book, some people do complain that this book is a little bit too slow or boring, or it's kind of a middle book, not a lot happens. I personally disagree. I think a lot does happen, and it's a lot of character growth in this book. Elend sees a lot more time. Sazed grows a lot in this book. Vin goes through a lot in this book, kind of learning more about herself, her relationship with Elend, her relationship with allomancy and how she's being used as a weapon. I mean, she goes through a ton in this book. And yeah, there is a lot of politics, but what's a good way of putting this? It's not as complex or like as in depth or deep as like a Song of Ice and Fire, which is all about political maneuvering and trying to win the throne. This is kind of like a mini version of that, but I think, again, Sanderson knocked it out of the park. I think this was a great follow-up to the Final Empire personally, and I was not bored by any of the politicking. Aside from the politics that are kind of like the heavy focus of this book, you do learn more about allomancy. So they do introduce a new metal called duralumin. I hope I'm saying that right. I apologize if I'm not. But basically, Vin learns how to use this duralumin and boost her other abilities, essentially. So she learns how to use it with pewter, and pewter gives you strength, and lacks you kind of ignore fatigue, things like that. So like pewter arms thugs, the big tough guys that can burn pewter and be strong. She's learned how to do that, but burn duralumin and basically have like bursts of energy. So there was this one scene in this book that was fantastic. One of the combat scenes in this book, she burns duralumin and pewter and basically headbutts somebody, and just the sheer force of that just blows this guy's head up. Without getting into spoilers, there are some crazy things toward the end that kind of remind me of Lord of the Rings a little bit, in which the Fellowship kind of introduces you to your band of characters. You have some small skirmishes, smaller battles. You lose a couple of them along the way. Kind of reminds me of the first book. Then you get into the second book, the stakes are a little bit higher, more casualties are likely, and the scale of the combat is higher. The scale is higher. That made sense. The scale of combat is bigger than the first book. So you have like a larger scale battle, which is the coolest thing that I had read up to this point in a book. Basically, I'm going to spoil a little bit of this fight that happens at the end. So if you want to skip ahead past that, please click this time code and you'll skip that. But I have to talk about it. So towards the end, Luthadel is being sieged by the Colossus. They basically went into a blood frenzy and are just relentlessly attacking the city. They're tearing down the walls, they're busting through the gates, climbing up over the walls, and they're just basically slaughtering everybody. Essentially, at this point, they bust through, and Sazed, who has never really fought in these books yet, just goes all out with Spherichemy. So he boosts up, he basically roid rages out, becomes this like 11-foot monster, and just starts wailing on Kolos, just taking him out left and right. And as soon as he kind of reaches his end point, he's running out of his strength, he's gonna die, essentially. Vin just comes rushing in a whirlwind of allomancy and daggers and just starts massacring Kolos, just like her own blood frenzy, essentially, just destroys hundreds of them. She finally gets to a point where she's like, all right, there's too many of them to kill. I'm going to try something. And she tries something that she learned earlier in the book, when she actually was able to almost mind control a Kandra, which isn't supposed to be able to happen. And she does a huge burst of duralumin and soothes the entire Kolos army and takes control of them. And at that point, it's like, okay, Vin is on like a whole nother level up here, way higher than Kelsier ever was. And she's like, all right, we're gonna go get Straff because he's pissing me off. So they march out of the city, and then the next scene, you see Straff look up into the sky, and Vin is just flying through the air with a Kolos sword and just shears him in half. And I read that and I was just like, that was so cool. Okay, back off of spoilers. So part of this book does introduce you to a few new characters. You dive deeper into Orasur, who we met in the first book, who is the Kandra that's part of the crew, and Tindwyl. So Tindwyl is a Terrace woman, so similar to Sazed, but she is much different personality-wise. She essentially comes in to help train Elend to be a king. She gives him a makeover, new haircut, new clothes, styles him up, and basically builds his confidence throughout the book. So he basically teaches him to be more stern, be more direct and kingly, because he's kind of, he's trying to cooperate a lot, and he's trying to cater to other people's opinions, and she's like, no, you need to cut that out. Like, this is how you lead, this is how you command a room. I personally loved her. I've heard some people didn't, but I thought she was hilarious. She was like an angry mom at her son for not cleaning up his room the entire book, and it was hilarious. Also, because of Marsh's and Seize's journey back to Luthadel, you actually start to learn more about the Steel Inquisition and a little bit more about the Inquisitors themselves. I said Steel Inquisition, the Steel Ministry, and the Jesus Christ. You learn more about the Steel Inquisitors and the Steel Ministry and kind of what they've been up to. You learn about hemalurgy a little bit, where they're actually jamming spikes into people. It's another kind of, it's not allomancy, so there's allomancy, hemalurgy, and fairchemy, and you start learning more about that. You learn more about the Lord Ruler's past. There's a lot of more like world building and background and history to learn in this book, and maybe some people find that boring. I personally loved it because I love learning more about this world of Mistborn that Sanderson created, and I think it was fantastic. And then, of course, in the background you have the whole lore around the Well of Ascension, right? It's the name of the book. It's a big pivotal part of this book, and a lot of Vin's quest and Elend's quest ends up being involved with it as well, is to find this Well of Ascension. It's supposed to be this great power. She's not exactly sure what it's going to do, but they kind of know that they need to find it, and that's essentially Vin's quest, which of course leads me towards the end, which I'm not going to spoil, but Sanderson loves to do this with his books. This is the second book of a trilogy, so of course it ends with you on the edge of your seat. Immediately you just want to pick up the third book and read it, which I did. The second I put this book down, I read through the epilogue and I was just like, okay, Hero of Ages, let's go. I think that's all I have to say about the Well of Ascension. Again, I think it was a great second book of the trilogy. It was that perfect middle story to kind of grow and build on the first one, and then leave a lot of questions open for the third book, which you hope to be answered. The combat was fantastic. Once again, I think Sanderson does some of the best fight scenes I've ever read in a story, and I would love to see it in some kind of TV show or movie. I think it would be incredible to watch on a big screen. Lots of character growth in this book. Seize grows massively in this book. Vin, Elend, the rest of the crew, Spook gets a little bit more involved, my boy Spook. Kind of everybody gets more involved in this story. I mean, Marsh, even from the first book, going through what he went through and then kind of growing in this story, he's kind of lost in his head and doesn't exactly know what's going on. So there's a lot of mystery in this book as well. Long story short, you should read this book. If you liked Final Empire, you like Brandon Sanderson, I think you're going to love this one. It builds perfectly on the first book for me, and I had a blast this entire time. But I think that's going to do it for me and my review of The Well of Ascension. But I want to know what you guys think. So did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you think there's too much politics, too little politics, not enough character growth, not enough battles? What were your opinions? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and I'd love to have a conversation with you. So if you could leave a comment down below, go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell icon, you know, all the typical YouTube stuff, so you're alerted every time I make a video. I will be doing weekly videos, so obviously keep in tune next week for my Hero of Ages review, which will be coming up next. And if you haven't seen my Final Empire review, I'm going to link that right up here, so go ahead and take a look at that, and keep reading, guys. See you next time.